knees! Get on the ground now!
Hands up! Don't move!
Do it now, on your knees!
Okay.
Facing away, down on the ground, all the way down.
My son.
Hands behind your back, do not move.
My son is in the car, please.
Cuffs secure, stay still.
I've got the kid.
You're okay, buddy, hang on.
Imagine standing in a parking lot on a warm summer afternoon. Your child is in the back seat of your car, happily munching on snacks you just bought. The sun is casting long shadows across the asphalt, and everything feels perfectly ordinary. Then, in a matter of seconds, your entire world turns upside down. Police vehicles come screaming in from every direction. Officers leap out with weapons drawn. Rifles are pointed at your face. Commands are being shouted, and your 6-year-old son is watching everything unfold through the rear window. This is not a scene from an action movie. This is not a dramatic recreation. This actually happened to a young mother in a small town in America. And what makes this story so disturbing is not just the terror of that initial moment, but everything that came after. Because even when the officers realized they had made a terrible mistake, even when they confirmed beyond any doubt that they had the wrong person, they did not simply apologize and let her go. What they did instead reveals something deeply troubling about how power operates when there are no consequences for its abuse. If you care about understanding how ordinary citizens can find themselves caught in the machinery of law enforcement through no fault of their own, this is a story you need to hear from beginning to end. It will make you think differently about the assumptions we make about police procedures, about the technology we trust, and about what happens when institutions refuse to admit they were wrong. The events took place on a Saturday in mid-August of 2024 in a quiet town called Ridgewood in northwestern Arkansas. It was the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and wave to their neighbors. The kind of place where violent crime was something you heard about on the news, always happening somewhere else. The kind of place where most residents had never had a negative interaction with law enforcement in their entire lives. Melissa Thornton was 28 years old that summer. She had lived in and around Ridgewood her entire life, graduating from the local high school, working various jobs around town, and eventually settling into a routine that revolved around her most important responsibility, raising her son Dylan, who had just turned 7 the month before. On that particular Saturday, Melissa and Dylan had spent the morning at home. The heat had kept them indoors for most of the day, watching cartoons and playing games in the air conditioning. But by late afternoon, Dylan had started getting restless, as 7-year-olds tend to do. He wanted to go somewhere, anywhere, just to break up the monotony of the day. Melissa decided they would take a short drive to the Quick Stop on Highway 62. It was only about 10 minutes from their house, a small convenience store that sold snacks, drinks, and lottery tickets. Dylan loved their selection of candy, and Melissa figured it would be a nice treat after a long day stuck inside. She grabbed her keys, made sure Dylan had his shoes on, and they headed out to her car. The car was a silver 2011 Cadillac DTS, a 4-door sedan that Melissa had bought used about 2 years earlier. It was not a fancy vehicle by any means, but it was reliable, comfortable, and paid off. The temporary Arkansas registration tag was clearly visible in the rear window, still valid for another 3 weeks. Everything about the car was completely legal and properly documented. Melissa buckled Dylan into his booster seat in the back, made sure his seatbelt was secure, and climbed into the driver's seat. She started the engine, adjusted her mirrors out of habit, and pulled out of the driveway. The drive to the Quick Stop was uneventful. They passed familiar houses, familiar streets, familiar landmarks. Dylan chatted about a video game he wanted, and Melissa half listened while keeping her eyes on the road. They arrived at the Quick Stop around 4:30 in the afternoon. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of other vehicles scattered near the entrance. Melissa pulled into a spot near the front door, cut the engine, and helped Dylan out of his booster seat. They walked into the store together, hand in hand. Inside, the air conditioning was working overtime against the August heat. A radio behind the counter was playing country music at low volume. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, looked up briefly and offered a tired smile. It was the kind of scene that plays out 1,000 times a day in convenience stores across America. Nothing remarkable, nothing memorable, just a mother and her child buying snacks on a Saturday afternoon. Dylan made his selections carefully, as 7-year-olds do when given freedom of choice in a candy aisle. He eventually settled on a bag of sour gummy worms and a chocolate bar. Melissa grabbed a bottle of water for herself and a small bag of chips. They paid at the counter, exchanged pleasantries with the clerk, and headed back out into the heat. This is where everything changed. Melissa had just helped Dylan back into his booster seat. She was walking around to the driver's side of her car when she noticed something strange in her peripheral vision. Movement. Fast movement. Multiple vehicles approaching the parking lot at high speed. Her first thought was that there must be some kind of emergency nearby, maybe a fire or an accident on the highway. She paused, her hand on the door handle, watching as 3 patrol cars came racing into the parking lot. But they were not racing past the quick stop on their way somewhere else. They were converging on her location. They were coming directly toward her. The vehicles screeched to a halt, forming a semicircle around her car. Doors flew open before the engines had even stopped. Officers emerged with their weapons already drawn. Melissa saw rifles. She saw pistols. She saw uniformed men in tactical positions, using their car doors as cover, all of them pointing their weapons at her. Everything after that happened in a blur of shouted commands and raw terror. Multiple voices were yelling at once, creating a cacophony of overlapping instructions. Get on the ground. Down on your face. Hands where we can see them. Do it now. Do it now. Melissa's mind struggled to process what was happening. This had to be a mistake. There had to be some kind of misunderstanding. She was a mother buying snacks with her son. She had never committed a crime in her life. She did not even have a speeding ticket on her record. Why were their guns pointed at her? Why were these officers treating her like a dangerous criminal? But there was no time for questions. No time for explanations. The officers were advancing, still shouting, still pointing their weapons. And somewhere behind her, inside the car, her 7-year-old son was watching everything through the window. Melissa dropped to her knees on the hot asphalt. She lowered herself onto her stomach as commanded, the rough pavement scraping against her arms and cheek. She felt hands grabbing her wrists, pulling them behind her back. Cold metal encircled her wrists and clicked tight. Handcuffs. She was being handcuffed, and through it all, she could hear Dylan crying. Her little boy, secured in his booster seat, was watching his mother get thrown to the ground and restrained by armed police officers. He was screaming for her, not understanding what was happening, not knowing if she was hurt, not knowing if she was in danger. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it would feel like to be in Melissa's position. Your face is pressed against sun-heated pavement. Your arms are wrenched behind your back. Strange men with guns are standing over you, and your child is crying out for you, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to comfort him. This is the reality of being on the receiving end of an armed police response. This is what happens when officers decide you are a threat first and ask questions later. The trauma does not announce itself politely and wait for permission. It crashes through your life like a wrecking ball, and you're left to pick up the pieces afterward. But here is what makes this story different from so many others. Here is what elevates this incident from a terrible mistake to something far more concerning. Because while Melissa lay handcuffed on the ground, the officers finally got around to checking whether they actually had the right person. One of the officers, a trooper named Kevin Hartley, approached Melissa's car. He leaned in through the open driver's side window and began reading the vehicle identification number, that unique sequence of letters and numbers stamped into the dashboard that identifies every vehicle ever manufactured. He called out the VIN over his radio, digit by digit, letter by letter. The response came back within moments, and that response changed everything. The VIN did not match. The car they were looking for was a silver 2015 Cadillac CTS. Melissa's car was a silver 2011 Cadillac DTS. Similar looking perhaps if you were not paying close attention, but completely different vehicles with completely different identification numbers. The dispatcher confirmed it clearly. This was not the car they were tracking, so what happened next? You might assume that the officers immediately apologized, removed the handcuffs, and helped Melissa off the ground. You might assume they checked on the traumatized child in the back seat. You might assume they expressed remorse for the terror they had just inflicted on an innocent family. If those were your assumptions, you would be wrong. Here is what actually happened after the officers confirmed they had detained the wrong person. Melissa remained on the ground. The handcuffs stayed on her wrists. And instead of releasing her and apologizing, the officers began a new line of inquiry. They demanded her identification. They wanted her driver's license. They wanted to run her name through their database to check for outstanding warrants. Think about the logic of that decision, or rather, think about the complete absence of logic. The officers now knew with absolute certainty that Melissa had done nothing wrong. They had confirmed that her car was not the vehicle they were searching for. She was not a suspect. She was not connected to any crime. She was simply an innocent woman who happened to be driving a vaguely similar car in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet they continued to detain her. They continued to keep her in handcuffs. They continued to treat her as if she had some obligation to prove her innocence, even though she had never been suspected of anything in the first place. If you have been following this channel for a while, you know that we often discuss the constitutional protections that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. To legally detain someone, police officers must have reasonable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. To arrest someone, they need probable cause. What reasonable suspicion existed to continue detaining Melissa after they confirmed she was in the wrong car? None. What probable cause existed to keep her handcuffed and run her information through the system? Absolutely none. The officers knew she was innocent. They knew they had made a mistake, and they chose to continue violating her rights anyway. The question you have to ask yourself is, why? Why would trained law enforcement officers knowingly continue an unlawful detention? Why would they keep an innocent woman in handcuffs while her child screamed in the car behind her? There are several possible explanations, and none of them reflect well on the officers involved or on the institution they represent. Perhaps it was ego. Admitting a mistake, especially a mistake this dramatic and this public, would have been embarrassing. It would have meant acknowledging that all the tactical positioning, all the drawn weapons, all the shouted commands had been directed at the wrong person. For some officers, it might be easier to continue asserting authority than to admit error. Perhaps it was training. Many police departments train their officers to maintain control of a situation at all costs. The thinking goes that once you have detained someone, releasing them prematurely could create a safety risk. But this training makes no sense when applied to someone who has already been confirmed to be completely innocent. There was no safety risk from Melissa Thornton. She was a mother buying candy for her son. Perhaps it was simply habit. Once the machinery of law enforcement starts moving in a particular direction, it can be difficult to reverse course. Paperwork needs to be completed, reports need to be filed, names need to be run through databases. The bureaucratic momentum of the system carries forward even when the original justification has evaporated. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Melissa lay on that hot parking lot pavement for several more minutes while the officers processed her information. Every second felt like an eternity. Every moment was another moment of terror, another moment of humiliation, another moment of her son watching and crying and not understanding why this was happening to his mother. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. If you were in Melissa's position, how would you feel? Not in that initial moment of shock and fear, but in those long minutes afterward, when you knew the officers knew they were wrong, and they refused to let you go anyway. Would you feel angry? Would you feel helpless? Would you feel like the system that was supposed to protect you had instead become your tormentor? If this story is resonating with you, if you find yourself thinking about the implications of what happened here, I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to this channel. We cover stories like this regularly, not to demonize law enforcement as a whole, but to shine a light on the specific instances where power is abused and citizens' rights are violated. The more people who understand these issues, the better chance we have of creating accountability. Let me take you back to that parking lot and fill in some additional details about what the officers were doing while Melissa remained detained. The entire operation had been set in motion because of a tracking device. Specifically, it was a consumer-grade Bluetooth tracking tag, the kind you can buy at any electronics store and attach to your keys or your luggage. Someone had reported their vehicle stolen and mentioned that they had one of these trackers hidden somewhere in the car. The tracker was pinging from somewhere in the Ridgewood area, and the state troopers had been dispatched to locate and recover the stolen vehicle. Here is the first problem with that approach. These consumer tracking devices are not designed for precision location tracking. They work by detecting nearby smartphones and using those phones to anonymously relay the tracker's approximate location to a central server. The accuracy can vary wildly depending on how many compatible smartphones are in the area. In a crowded urban environment, you might get accuracy within a few dozen feet. In a rural area with fewer phones around, the margin of error can expand to hundreds of feet or even more. The officers knew this. They had to know this. Anyone who has ever used one of these devices knows that the blue dot on the map is an approximation, not a precise location. It tells you that your lost item is somewhere in this general vicinity. It does not tell you exactly which car in a parking lot contains the tracker. And yet, the officers decided to launch a high-risk tactical approach based on this imprecise technology. They saw a silver 4-door Cadillac sedan in the general area where the tracker was pinging. They did not verify the license plate. They did not check the VIN before approaching. They did not even confirm the exact model of the vehicle. They simply saw a car that looked vaguely right and decided to treat its occupants as dangerous criminals. The second problem is even more fundamental. Even if the tracking device had been perfectly accurate, even if it had led them directly to the correct vehicle, the officers still did not know who they were looking for. They had no suspect description. They had no idea whether the person who allegedly stole the car was male or female, young or old, armed or unarmed. They were operating completely blind, using maximum force against an unknown person based solely on a technology signal. This is not how responsible law enforcement works. This is not how trained professionals are supposed to approach a potential vehicle recovery. You do not roll up on an unknown situation with rifles pointed at everyone in sight. You do not treat every occupant as a deadly threat when you have no evidence suggesting any threat exists. You do not traumatize innocent children because a blinking dot on a map told you to go to a particular parking lot. But that is exactly what these officers did. And now, with Melissa still lying on the ground, they were running her name through their database as if she were a criminal they had cleverly apprehended rather than an innocent victim of their incompetence. The dispatch came back clean, of course. Melissa Thornton had no outstanding warrants. She had no criminal history. She had never been in trouble with the law in her entire life. She was exactly what she appeared to be. A law-abiding citizen who had been terrorized for no reason. One of the officers, a trooper named Derek Webb, finally moved to remove the handcuffs, but he did not move quickly. He did not rush to release her as soon as the dispatch confirmed she was clean. He took his time, almost leisurely, as if there were no particular urgency to ending this woman's ordeal. When the handcuffs finally came off, Melissa's wrists were sore and red. She pushed herself up from the pavement, her arms shaking, her clothes dirty from the ground. Her first instinct was to get to her son. She stumbled toward the car where Dylan was still buckled into his booster seat, still crying, still frightened out of his mind. She opened the door and pulled him into her arms, holding him tight, whispering reassurances that everything was okay, that Mommy was fine, that they were safe. But even as she said those words, she knew they were not entirely true. How could anything be okay after what had just happened? How could they feel safe when armed men had just pointed weapons at them for no reason at all? And where were the officers during this moment? What were they doing while a mother tried to comfort her traumatized child? They were milling around the parking lot. Some were talking on their radios. Some were conferring with each other. Some were looking at their phones or making notes. What none of them were doing was apologizing. Not a single officer approached Melissa to offer a sincere expression of regret for what had just happened. Not one of them acknowledged that they had just put an innocent family through a terrifying ordeal. The supervising officer at the scene eventually walked over to where Melissa was standing with Dylan in her arms. His name was Sergeant Marcus Powell, and he was the ranking trooper present during the incident. This should have been the moment when leadership and basic human decency converged. This should have been when someone in authority took responsibility for what had gone wrong. Instead, Sergeant Powell's interaction with Melissa was brief and businesslike. He confirmed that she was free to go. He mentioned something about the tracking device leading them to the general area. He said words that sounded vaguely apologetic without actually accepting any responsibility or expressing genuine remorse. It was the kind of non-apology apology that institutions specialize in, where they acknowledge that something unfortunate happened while carefully avoiding any admission that they did something wrong. And then the officers left. One by one, they got back into their vehicles and drove away, off to continue their search for the actual stolen car, which was apparently still somewhere in the area. They left Melissa standing in that parking lot, dirty and shaken, holding her crying son, trying to process what had just happened to them. The other customers and employees of the Quick Stop had been watching the entire scene unfold. Some had pulled out their phones to record. Others had simply stood frozen, not quite believing what they were seeing. A few of them approached Melissa after the officers left, asking if she was all right, offering water, expressing their own shock at the intensity of the police response. But what could they really do? What could any of them do? The officers were gone. The damage was done. And there was no one to hold accountable in that moment. No one to complain to. No way to undo the trauma that had just been inflicted on an innocent family. I want to take a moment here to zoom out from the immediate incident and talk about what this kind of experience does to a person, because the effects do not end when the handcuffs come off. The effects do not disappear when the police cars drive away. For many people who go through something like this, the psychological impact can last for months or even years. There is a phenomenon that psychologists call a shattered assumption. Most of us go through life with certain basic beliefs about how the world works. We believe that if we follow the rules, we will be safe. We believe that authorities will protect us, not harm us. We believe that innocence is a shield against mistreatment. When something like this happens, those assumptions get shattered. The victim suddenly realizes that following the rules does not guarantee safety. They realize that authorities can and do harm innocent people. They realize that their innocence did not protect them at all, that it made no difference to the men with guns who threw them to the ground. For Melissa, this realization began to sink in during the drive home from the Quick Stop. Her hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. Her heart was still racing. Every time she saw a police vehicle on the road, she felt a spike of fear. What if they came after her again? What if there was another mistake? What if next time it ended even worse? And then there was Dylan. For the rest of that evening, he refused to let Melissa out of his sight. He asked questions that no 7-year-old should have to ask. Why did those men have guns? Why did they put Mommy on the ground? Did Mommy do something wrong? Are they going to come back? How do you explain something like this to a child? How do you tell him that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are terrifying, and sometimes there is nothing we can do about it? How do you restore his sense of safety in a world where armed men can appear out of nowhere and treat you like a criminal for no reason? These are questions that Melissa would continue to wrestle with in the days and weeks that followed. The incident at the Quick Stop was not something she could simply put behind her and forget. It became a part of her story, a defining moment that changed how she saw the world and her place in it. In the immediate aftermath, Melissa did what many people in her situation do. She tried to find answers. She wanted to understand how this could have happened. She wanted to know if there would be any accountability for the officers involved. She wanted, if nothing else, some acknowledgement that what had been done to her was wrong. She started by filing a formal complaint with the state police department. This required navigating a bureaucratic process that seemed designed to discourage complaints rather than facilitate them. She had to fill out forms, provide detailed accounts of what happened, submit her contact information, and then wait. Wait for someone to review her complaint. Wait for someone to investigate. Wait for some kind of response. While she waited, she also reached out to a local attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. His name was Robert Engelman, and he ran a small practice that focused primarily on cases involving police misconduct and government accountability. When Melissa told him her story, he listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and then told her something that both surprised and validated her. What happened to her, he explained, was not just a mistake. It was a constitutional violation. The officers had subjected her to an unreasonable seizure without probable cause. They had continued to detain her after confirming she was innocent. They had violated her Fourth Amendment rights, and she had grounds to pursue legal action against the officers involved and potentially against the state police department itself. This was the first time anyone in a position of authority had told Melissa that she was right to be upset. The first time anyone had confirmed that what happened to her was not just unfortunate, but actually illegal. It was a small validation, but it mattered. It meant that she was not overreacting. It meant that her sense of outrage was justified. Robert agreed to take her case. Over the following weeks, he gathered evidence, reviewed police reports, and prepared a lawsuit against the state troopers involved in the incident. The lawsuit named Kevin Hartley, the officer who read the VIN and confirmed the wrong vehicle. It named Derek Webb, the officer who was slow to remove the handcuffs after the mistake was confirmed. And it named Sergeant Marcus Powell, the supervising officer who failed to ensure that his subordinates treated an innocent citizen with basic dignity. The lawsuit also named Captain Theodore Vance, the commander of the Regional Trooper Unit. While Captain Vance had not been present at the scene, the lawsuit argued that he bore responsibility for the training and supervision of the officers under his command. The aggressive tactical approach, the failure to verify the vehicle before engaging, the continued detention after the mistake was confirmed, these were all patterns that suggested systemic problems in how the unit operated. I want to stop here and share something with you. Throughout my years covering stories like this, I have seen a pattern emerge again and again. When police officers make mistakes, the initial response from their departments is almost always the same: defend, deflect, and deny. This is not about individual officers being bad people. Some are, of course, but many are simply doing their jobs as they understand them within a system that does not incentivize accountability. When something goes wrong, the institutional response is to protect the institution. Admitting fault opens the door to lawsuits, settlements, and reforms. It is easier in the short term to circle the wagons and hope the story goes away. The problem is that this approach perpetuates the very behaviors that caused the problem in the first place. If officers know they will be protected even when they violate citizens' rights, what incentive do they have to change? If departments never admit wrongdoing, how can they learn from their mistakes? This is why cases like Melissa's matter, not just for her individual justice, but for the broader principle of accountability. Every lawsuit that succeeds, every story that gets told, every citizen who refuses to accept mistreatment creates pressure for change. It chips away at the institutional armor that protects bad practices. It makes it harder for departments to simply shrug and move on. If you believe in that principle, if you believe that holding power accountable is essential to a functioning democracy, then I would ask you to consider sharing this story with others. The more people who know about cases like this, the more pressure there is for meaningful reform. We cannot change what we do not see, and we cannot fix what we refuse to acknowledge. Let me return to the story and tell you what happened after the lawsuit was filed. As expected, the state police department declined to comment on the pending litigation. This is standard practice, and legally, there are reasons for it. But the silence also serves another purpose. It prevents the public from hearing the department's perspective on what went wrong, which in turn prevents any real accountability conversation from happening. The officers involved in the incident were not suspended or disciplined in any public way. They continued their regular duties, driving their patrol cars, making traffic stops, potentially subjecting other innocent citizens to the same treatment that Melissa had received. There was no indication that the department had conducted any internal review of the incident or made any changes to their procedures. This lack of visible accountability was frustrating for Melissa, but it was not surprising to Robert. He had been through this process many times before. He knew that real accountability, when it came, usually came through the courts rather than through internal department processes. The lawsuit would take months or even years to work its way through the legal system, but it was the best path forward. In the meantime, the story began to attract attention beyond the immediate community. Local news outlets picked up on the lawsuit filing. A few regional publications ran stories about the incident, usually with headlines emphasizing the wrongful detention angle. The story was shared on social media, where it provoked the kind of divided reaction that these cases always seem to generate. Some people expressed outrage at the officer's behavior. They pointed out the obvious constitutional violations, the trauma inflicted on the child, the complete lack of accountability. They argued that this kind of incident revealed deeper problems with how police departments approach their interactions with the public. Others defended the officers. They argued that police work is dangerous, that mistakes happen when you are trying to recover stolen vehicles, that the officers were just doing their jobs. They suggested that Melissa was being opportunistic by filing a lawsuit. that she was trying to profit from a simple misunderstanding. This division is itself revealing. It shows how deeply polarized our society has become when it comes to questions of police accountability. For some people, any criticism of law enforcement is automatically suspect. For others, any defense of police officers is automatically bootlicking. The actual facts of individual cases often get lost in the noise of tribal affiliations and pre-existing beliefs. But the facts in this case are not actually in dispute. The officers approached the wrong vehicle. They drew weapons on an innocent woman and her child. They handcuffed her and detained her. They confirmed their mistake and continued the detention anyway. Same situation in the exact same way. Critics of qualified immunity argue that it creates a catch-22 situation. You cannot establish that a right was violated unless you can find a previous case where that exact right was violated. But if qualified immunity prevents those cases from going forward, then the right can never be clearly established, and officers can continue violating it with impunity. In Melissa's case, however, the constitutional violations were so clear-cut that qualified immunity was unlikely to provide protection. The right to be free from detention without reasonable suspicion is about as clearly established as any right can be. The continued detention after confirming her innocence was particularly damaging to any qualified immunity defense the officers might try to mount. As the case progressed, settlement discussions began. This is typical in these kinds of lawsuits. Going to trial is expensive and time-consuming for both sides. The government, represented by state attorneys, often prefers to settle cases quietly rather than risk a public trial that could generate negative publicity and potentially larger damage awards. For Melissa, the settlement discussions presented a dilemma. On one hand, settling would provide her with compensation and closure more quickly than continuing to fight. On the other hand, settlements are often accompanied by confidentiality agreements that prevent the victim from discussing the case publicly. They allow the government to resolve the matter without admitting wrongdoing. This is another way that the system protects itself from accountability. By settling cases confidentially, departments can avoid the kind of public scrutiny that might force real change. They can pay off individual victims while continuing the practices that created the problem in the first place. Each settlement becomes just another line item in the budget rather than a signal that something needs to change. Robert presented the settlement offer to Melissa and explained her options. She could accept the offer, which would provide her with a meaningful amount of compensation, but would require her to keep the terms confidential. Or she could continue fighting, which would mean more time, more stress, and more uncertainty, but could potentially result in a larger award and a more public accounting of what the officers did. What would you do in her position? It is easy, from the outside, to say that victims should always fight for maximum accountability, but when you are living through the process, when the stress of litigation is affecting your daily life, when your child is still dealing with the aftermath of the trauma, the calculation becomes more complicated. Sometimes the right choice is to take what you can get and move on. Sometimes the fight is not worth the cost. I'm curious what you think about this. If you have ever been in a situation where you had to choose between practical resolution and principled stand, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments. These are not easy decisions, and there is rarely a clearly right answer. Melissa ultimately decided to continue with the lawsuit rather than accept the initial settlement offer. Her reasoning was simple. She wanted the officers to face some kind of public accountability for what they did. Accepting a confidential settlement would make it easier for the department to sweep the whole thing under the rug. She did not want Dylan to grow up thinking that what happened to them did not matter. This decision meant more months of legal wrangling, more depositions, more document requests, more waiting. The wheels of justice turned slowly, especially when the defendant is a government entity with deep pockets and little incentive to expedite proceedings. During this period, Robert was able to obtain some additional documentation about the incident through the discovery process. The police reports confirmed what Melissa had experienced. They showed that Trooper Hartley had read the VIN number and received confirmation from dispatch that it did not match the stolen vehicle. They showed that despite this confirmation, the officers continued to detain Melissa and ran her identification through the warrant database. What the reports did not show was any acknowledgement that this was wrong. The officers framed their actions as standard procedure, as if continuing to detain an innocent person after confirming their innocence was simply part of proper police work. There was no self-reflection, no recognition that they had made a serious error, no indication that anyone involved understood the gravity of what they had done. The reports also revealed more details about the technology that had led to this situation in the first place. The tracking device had indeed been pinging from the general area of the quick stop, but the accuracy radius was significant, encompassing not just the parking lot, but several surrounding businesses and a stretch of highway. The officers had seen Melissa's silver Cadillac and made assumptions based on superficial similarity rather than verified identification. This raises important questions about how law enforcement uses consumer tracking technology. These devices were designed for people to find their lost keys, not for police to conduct armed tactical approaches on unknown vehicles. The margin of error built into these systems is acceptable when the stakes are low, when the worst-case scenario is that you look in the wrong drawer for your wallet. But the margin of error becomes catastrophic when the result is weapons pointed at innocent families. Should there be standards for how police use this kind of technology? Should there be requirements for verification before they approach a vehicle with weapons drawn? Should there be training protocols that account for the inherent limitations of consumer-grade tracking devices? These are the kinds of questions that lawsuits like Melissa's can help answer, not just by providing compensation to individual victims, but by creating legal precedents that shape how law enforcement operates in the future. Every case that goes to court becomes part of the body of case law that guides future decisions. Every judgment that holds officers accountable makes it slightly more difficult for the next officer to claim they did not know better. The case continued to progress through the legal system. As it did, something interesting happened. Other people started coming forward with their own stories of aggressive police responses based on inaccurate tracking device information. A regional news outlet ran a feature on the phenomenon, interviewing multiple families who had experienced similar incidents. The story of Melissa Thornton became just one example of a broader pattern. This kind of publicity is exactly what government institutions fear most. Not because they are worried about individual lawsuits, which they have resources to handle, but because they are worried about the narrative that emerges when multiple stories start to connect. One incident can be dismissed as an aberration. Multiple incidents start to look like a systemic problem, and systemic problems require systemic solutions, which means changes to procedures, training, and maybe even personnel. The state police department eventually issued a statement acknowledging that they were reviewing their procedures for responding to tracking device alerts. The statement did not admit any wrongdoing in Melissa's case or any of the other cases that had come to light. It simply said that the department was committed to continuous improvement and was evaluating whether changes were needed. This is progress, of a sort. It is not the accountability that Melissa was looking for, but it is an acknowledgement that something needed to change, and it only happened because she refused to let the matter drop. It only happened because she filed a lawsuit, because she let her story be told, because she forced the institution to respond. The lawsuit eventually reached a resolution. I am not going to disclose the specific terms here because that is Melissa's information to share if and when she chooses. What I can tell you is that the resolution included both a financial component and a requirement for certain policy reviews within the department. It was not everything that Melissa had hoped for, but it was more than what the department had initially offered. More importantly, the case created a record. It documented what happened, preserved the facts in legal proceedings, and established that the officers' actions were violations of constitutional rights. That record will be there for the next person who finds themselves in a similar situation. It will be there for the next attorney who needs to argue that this kind of conduct is not acceptable. It will be there as evidence that the system, for all its flaws, can still produce some measure of accountability when people are willing to fight for it. As I wrap up this story, I want to reflect on what it tells us about the relationship between citizens and the institutions that are supposed to serve and protect them. The officers who converged on Melissa's car that August afternoon were not evil people. They were not cartoon villains twirling their mustaches and looking for innocent people to torment. They were probably ordinary individuals doing what they thought was their job, following procedures they had been trained to follow, reacting to a situation based on incomplete information and poor technology. But that is precisely the problem. The problem is not that policing attracts uniquely bad people. The problem is that policing, as it is currently structured in many places, does not adequately discourage bad outcomes. It does not require verification before aggressive action. It does not incentivize restraint or caution. It does not hold officers accountable when they get it wrong. And it actively protects them from consequences through doctrines like qualified immunity and practices like confidential settlements. When a system is structured this way, you do not need bad people to get bad outcomes. You just need ordinary people following the path of least resistance within a system that does not penalize them for violating citizens' rights. The harm happens not because of malice, but because of indifference. Not because officers want to hurt innocent people, but because they face no meaningful consequences when they do. This is why stories like Melissa's matter. They remind us that the abstract principles enshrined in our Constitution have real-world implications for real people. The Fourth Amendment is not just a legal technicality. It is a promise that the government will not subject you to unreasonable treatment without justification. And when that promise is broken, it is broken in parking lots and on sidewalks, in front of children and bystanders, with consequences that ripple through lives for years. The question for all of us is what we are willing to do about it. Are we willing to share these stories so that more people understand what is happening? Are we willing to support organizations and attorneys who fight for accountability? Are we willing to contact our legislators and demand reforms? Or are we content to assume that it will not happen to us, that we will never be the one in the wrong place at the wrong time, that the system's failures are always someone else's problem? Melissa Thornton was an ordinary person living an ordinary life until the day she was not. She did not choose to become part of this story. She did not ask to have her constitutional rights violated. She simply went to buy snacks with her son and found herself on the receiving end of a system that failed her in every way that mattered. Her response, her refusal to accept what happened quietly, her willingness to fight for accountability, that is what makes her story worth telling. She could have let it go. She could have tried to forget it happened and move on with her life. Instead, she stood up and demanded that someone be held responsible. And in doing so, she contributed to a conversation that is bigger than her individual case, a conversation about what kind of society we want to live in and what we are willing to accept from the institutions that govern us. So here is my final question for you, the one I want you to think about long after this video ends. What would it take for you to fight back if something like this happened to you? What would it take for you to demand accountability when it would be easier to walk away? And if you have never had to face that question, are you doing anything to support those who do? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones, because the only way things change is when enough people decide that the current situation is unacceptable. When enough people tell their stories, share their experiences, and refuse to let institutions hide behind their walls of silence and legal protection. When enough people understand that government, left to its own devices, will not voluntarily do the right thing. Our rights do not end where convenience begins. Justice is difficult. Accountability is uncomfortable. But that is exactly why they matter. Deal with it. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If you found value in it, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video with others who might benefit from hearing it. The more people who engage with these issues, the more pressure there is for meaningful change. And that change starts with awareness. It starts with stories like this one. It starts with you. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and never be afraid to ask questions when power overreaches. That is not just your right. It is your responsibility as a citizen.